Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Portland's Friday Forum, Oregon's premier public affairs forum. I'm Jim Zarin, president of City Club, and I welcome you all, those of you here at the Governor Hotel and those of you listening on OPB radio or watching on cable television. We are glad you are with us for our program today on this Friday, the 10th of October, 2008. Today's program will feature a moderated debate on State Ballot Measure 65, which, if passed by Oregon's voters this November, would give all registered voters the same primary ballot and allow them to vote for any candidate they chose. The top two vote getters, regardless of party affiliation, would then advance to the general election. This so-called top two primary election system would be similar to the system approved by Washington state voters in 2004 and upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court earlier this year. Our debaters, Professor Paul Gronke and Phil Keisling, will help us Oregonians decide whether to vote for or against Measure 65 when we vote this fall. Now, before introducing the moderator of today's debate, who will explain the rules of procedure for the debate and introduce our debaters, I have just a very few announcements. For the benefit of our radio and television audiences and those seated around you, if you haven't already, please turn off your cell phones and anything else making inappropriate noise. I also want to thank our Friday Forum corporate sponsors, without whose generous financial support these time-honored Friday forums, including debates of City Club, would not be possible. Our corporate sponsors this quarter are the law firm of Barron Liebman, AARP Oregon, Comcast, and 3 Mile Canyon Farms. We thank them all for their support. Now, I also want to announce today a new sponsorship that we're doing at City Club for the very first time, and this is sponsorship of our research program. And if you have your reports on ballot measures 57 and 61 that we just approved, you'll see on the very back page there is an acknowledgement of the support of the Swigert Foundation and Tonkin Torp LLP to help the cost of underwriting our research program. And I want to just this time read the statement above it because it's important that all City Club members understand this. This is something that was approved by the Board of Directors after considerable discussion. The City Club of Portland is grateful to the following sponsors for their financial support to underwrite the expense of printing and distributing research reports during the 2008-2009 club year. Sponsors have agreed that their gifts are given and accepted without regard to the selection of research topics, study methodology, or report analyses, conclusions, recommendations, or other content, and without effect on decisions made by the club to approve reports or to advocate for their recommendations. So this is very important to the Board of Directors that we all understand this, but this is another source of financial support from our community for our research program. We're very grateful to our first two sponsors of our research program, the Swigert Foundation and Tonkin Torp LLP, and I'd like you to give them a round of applause. Thank you. Now, before I introduce the moderator, I just want to quickly mention again, as I have in various other debates we've been having this fall, that the mission of City Club is twofold. First, to inform our members and members of the public regarding public issues, and second, to mobilize our members and members of the community to become involved in those issues as citizens. And with this in mind, please note that we cannot achieve our mission if we are not open to information and views and arguments and messengers that are different from our predisposed personal opinions and preferences. So as such, I ask that all in the room today remain courteous and respectful and open to all information conveyed and all views expressed by both of our debaters today, even if you arrived here favoring or opposing ballot measure 65, and even when you disagree with what you hear from one or both of the debaters. By doing this, you will help further the kind of civil discourse of public issues that City Club stands for, and you will honor our debaters, our own process, and our broader community. Now to introduce our moderator. A moderator for today's debate has extensive experience in political reporting. She has covered numerous state legislative sessions in Oregon and also in Idaho, has followed local, state, and federal candidates on the campaign trail, and covered the 2000 Democratic National Convention in Los Angeles. As a 2002 American Political Science Association Fellow, she studied Congress and national politics in Washington, D.C., and as part of that nonpartisan fellowship program, she worked for a member of Congress on Capitol Hill, learning how national and local media is managed by a congressional office. Currently the Salem Bureau Chief for KATU Television News. Please welcome our debate moderator today, Melika Johnson. Melika?
Well, thank you for inviting me today. I'm usually sitting over there watching all of you eat, wondering what you're eating on your plates because we don't get a lot of lunch in TV news. I ate all of mine today. It was wonderful. Thank you so much. Well, it is my privilege to moderate this debate on ballot measure 65 between Mr. Phil Keisling, former Secretary of State of Oregon, who supports the measure, and Professor Paul Gronke, Professor of Political Science at Reed College, who opposes the measure. First, a brief description of the ballot measure before us today. Measure 65 is a citizen initiative whose chief sponsors are Mr. Phil Keisling, a Democrat and former Oregon Secretary of State, who is, again, here with us today, and Ms. Norma Paulus, a Republican, also a former Oregon Secretary of State. Measure 65 aims to change the current general election nomination process for most partisan offices. Currently, Oregon possesses a primary system in which the Democratic and Republican parties hold primary elections that are restricted to registered members of the parties, though any eligible voter may register with either party up to 21 days before the primary. The winner of each party's primary appears on the general election ballot. Minor parties do not hold their own primaries, but are able to place candidates on the general election ballot by filing qualifying documents with the Secretary of State and settling on a process for choosing their candidates, usually by holding a convention. Ballot Measure 65 would establish a system in which all registered Oregon voters would receive the same ballot for the spring primary, listing all candidates for most offices. A voter could vote for any one candidate regardless of the voter's or the candidate's party affiliation. Voters would not be restricted to voting for a member of their own party in the primary, nor would they need to be registered with a party to participate in the primary. A candidate's party affiliation, if any, would be listed on the ballot, along with any party endorsements that the candidate has received. The two candidates with the highest number of votes, regardless of party affiliation, would advance to the general election in November and would be the only candidates listed on the ballot for that office. This top two primary system would not apply to the presidential primary and would not alter election procedures for designated nonpartisan offices. And now a brief description of the format of our debate. This debate will have several sections. First, each speaker will give a 3-minute opening statement. Following the opening statement, speakers will respond to questions suggested in advance of this meeting by City Club's Friday Forum Committee and members of the City Club Study Committee that researched Measure 65. These are the only questions that will be asked today. There will be no questions from the floor. We will rely on the judgment of our distinguished panel of City Club members seated at the table below, these three folks right here, to decide whether or not the questions have indeed been answered by the speakers. If two or more of these members raise their cards indicating that they feel a question has not been answered, I will restate the question and ask the speaker to reply again. On our panel, we have Jeannie Crouch, Jamie Armstrong, and Patty Tillett. Our timekeeper today is Tony Iaccarino. He is not Basque, he is Italian, I asked. Following the City Club's questions, each speaker will have the opportunity to ask 3 questions of the other candidate. After the rotation of questions, each speaker will make a 3-minute closing statement. Please be respectful of the speakers and please hold all applause until the end of the program. I think you guys know that rule pretty well here. And now the speakers. Phil Keisling is the chief sponsor, along with former Secretary of State Norma Paulus, of Measure 65. He is the Executive Vice President for Sales and Marketing for Core Source Technology Group, an information technology and software development services company based in Beaverton. He has been with the company since 2000. From 1991 to 1999, Mr. Keisling served as Oregon Secretary of State, where he managed the agency and promoted a number of key initiatives, including performance auditing, moving the state's business registry online, and making Oregon the first state to hold all elections in a vote-by-mail format. Mr. Keisling's other political experiences includes 2 years in the Oregon House of Representatives, 3 years as a staff assistant to former House Speaker Vera Katz, and a brief stint in 1978 as a speechwriter for Tom McCall's gubernatorial campaign. His professional career also includes 6 years as a journalist, an investigative reporter for Portland's Willamette Week, and as an editor of the Washington Monthly Magazine in Washington, D.C. Paul Gronke is a professor of political science at Reed College in Portland and an expert on convenience and early voting, public opinion, congressional and presidential elections, and social science methodology. He has also conducted research on trust in government, the media, and the military, presidential approval, congressional representation, and congressional elections. Professor Gronke is the author of the book, The Electorate, the Campaign, and the Vote, and more than 24 scholarly articles, and has published or been quoted in numerous periodicals, including the New York Times, The Economist, the Christian Science Monitor, and the Los Angeles Times. His current research examines the phenomenon of early voting or balloting, whereby voters can cast their ballots at a place and time other than at the polling place on Election Day. In 2005, he established the Early Voting Information Center to study early voting and advocate for best practices in voting by mail and early voting systems. During the 2007-8 and 2008 academic years, Professor Gronke has been on leave from Reed College working on issues of election reform and election administration. Will the speakers please come forward and take their podiums? So we'll begin with opening statements. Mr. Keisling, you have 3 minutes.
Thank you. First and foremost, thank you for this opportunity to debate an issue that is fundamental to our notions of living in a democracy and a republic, and speaks to issues of participation and how we ensure that we have a politics and a system of government that allows us to constructively talk about important issues and then make progress on them. I want to fast forward and here's how it works. We have a U.S. Senate race. We have a governor's race, an open governor's seat. We have 5 congressional contests. We have 75 legislative contests and a host of other offices. For the first time in Oregon history, every candidate seeking those offices has to be on the same podiums with each other and talk to voters directly about what they would do if elected. For the first time in history, every voter, regardless of how they have chosen to register, has a chance to vote in every one of those races and vote for the candidate he or she thinks is best. For the first time in Oregon history, we will now have a system that lets everybody participate in that first round in elections as well as the second, because after the first, the top 2 go to the finals, regardless of their political party registration, just as people can vote regardless. Now, I respect the City Club's study process enormously, though I do note that there were 2 proponents of Measure 65 interviewed and 11 opponents. And 2 of the minor party leaders in this state who believe this ought to pass because it helps minor parties weren't even talked to. And at the end of the day, I think the City Club Study Committee erred not in its facts, but in its judgments. Because in effect, it didn't understand what all of you today in this audience across the state know intimately. You may not know the details of corrections policy or how lottery revenues are divvied up, but everyone here knows how the current system works. You know it disenfranchises 500,000 people who are registered independents or minor party members. Force them to renounce their independence in order to vote? Boy, that's not an idea that goes over very well. You know it's a system that does not treat every voter fairly and equally, like Measure 65 does. You know it's a system that consistently encourages, if not rewards, the type of harsh and shrill partisanship and polarization which you yourselves as a city club have so often bravely talked about, and put forward constructive suggestions about. 74% of the voters, regardless of party registration, support this. Vic Atiyeh, John Kitzhaber, Phil Keisling, Norma Paulus, a host of people of all political persuasions. This is a bold step for Oregon to take to make its future better.
All right, thank you. Professor Gronke?
Again, thanks for having me here today. I'm gratified to have my first opportunity to speak before the City Club. Unlike Secretary Keisling, I'm not a practicing politician. I've not run for public office, and I have no intention to do so in the future. My position on this measure does not grow out of my role as a party operative or a candidate. I'm a college professor, no more or no less. But I'm also one of you. I'm a voting citizen of the Oregon public, and it's from my position as a citizen of Oregon and as a political scientist that I come here today to speak in opposition to Measure 65. I think Measure 65 is a solution that doesn't fit the problem or the many problems it's supposed to solve. And I think it's very likely that Measure 65 will cause more problems down the road, needlessly complicated and expensive campaigns, a more, not less polarized legislature, and even possibly a return to smoke-filled rooms. Now, I was asked before I testified in front of the City Club committee to provide them with the name of a political scientist who might be in favor of this measure. I looked in Oregon. I looked nationwide. I found one who was able to give me an argument in favor of Measure 65, and this was a person that said, I grew up in Louisiana and I liked it. Now, I'm not asking Oregonians to let political scientists run their political system, but I do think it's important for the voters of the state to understand the facts of Measure 65 and not the myths and realities. So let me, the myths and the anecdotes. So let me dispel a few of these myths and anecdotes now. The first, the proponents claim that the new primary system is needed because the current system creates an ideologically polarized political system. They long for a return to the 1970s, some sort of nostalgia for the 70s, like the 70s show. In a few weeks, Jacob Hacker is going to come to speak to the City Club about party polarization. I ask you to read Jake's book. I ask you to listen to his lecture. You'll hear nothing about party primaries. There are many reasons that American politics have changed over the last 25 years, but party primaries have very little to do with it. I've asked Phil to name the extremists who are populating Oregon politics, who are in our legislature, and our governor, our secretaries of state, and he never seems to be able to provide a list. I applaud Phil's concern for voter turnout, but the facts of the matter is that Oregon is among the 5 highest turnout states in the nation, including in our primary. Our turnout in our primaries is over 50%, and non-affiliated voter turnout has doubled in the past decade. If we're turning non-affiliated voters away from our system, I don't know where the evidence is for that. Let's finally turn to the candidates, the people who are going to act within this new set of rules. The most important thing I want to convey about the top 2 is that the top 2 primary is not a nonpartisan primary. Your goal is not to win a majority. The goal in the top 2 primary is not to be in third, and that's critical. Here's where facts really matter. The Louisiana example is well known, where David Duke, the ex-Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan, ended up running for governor. The top 2 primary system does not produce contests between moderates, it produces contests between extremists. That's one of many reasons why I oppose the top 2 primary, and I hope you'll agree with me.
All right, thank you. We now move to the portion of the program where I will ask the questions prepared in advance by the City Club's Friday Forum Committee and the members of the City Club Study Committee that researched Measure 65. The speaker to whom the question is directed will have 60 seconds to respond to the question. Following each answer, the opposing speaker will have the option of a 45-second rebuttal. At times, I will direct an identical question to both speakers, in which case each speaker will have 60 seconds to respond to the question. The speakers have not seen these questions in advance. The first question is for Mr. Keisling. You argue that Measure 65 will bring voices of moderation into Oregon politics. Do you have any evidence that extreme partisanship is more of a problem today than in previous eras? And what's so bad about partisanship anyway?
Well, there are 2 completely different questions there. First of all, about moderation, yes, I do believe it will. But I also believe creativity and innovation to the table. Polls show, and Adam Davis has done a lot of this work, that highest levels in 30 years of people that say the legislative institutions can't solve our problems, aren't doing things. Look at the 2007 session. In the best of times, first in a generation, great economy, a lot of planets aligned, no serious discussion of tax reform, education reform. Health care had to get punted to the ballot. Land use got punted to the ballot. On the extremism question, I think the real chilling effect that party primaries have is illustrated by 2 things. One is Vic Backlund, moderate Republican who voted for a modest tax increase in the depths of our last budget crisis. He got whacked and pulled out of office because he was a spend-and-spend liberal, lost in the primary. And on my side and the Democratic side, the PERS issue, the inability to even talk about it until it became a $17 billion problem. Greg McPherson showed real leadership on that, and he paid a price for it in part.
All right, Professor Gronke, you have 45 seconds to respond if you want to.
Well, sure. Again, I'm looking for the examples of extremism in Oregon politics. I still haven't heard Phil tell me where they are. The 2007 legislature, let's take that on. The 2007 legislature worked very hard and a long time on land use legislation that they sent to the voters because the voters passed the first piece of land use legislation. They sent Measure 49 to the voters passed it. That's a great accomplishment. The 2007 legislature worked on a cigarette tax proposal that was also sent to the ballot for the voters. Phil points to these as failures. I point to these as accomplishments. The 2007 legislature passed a rainy day fund, something that Oregon has needed for a long, long time. The 2007 legislature worked on a domestic partnership bill. It seems to me the 2007 legislature, the many new members who were elected, was very effective, many accomplishments, seems to be working pretty well.
All right, Professor, the next question is for you. Polls show that Measure 65 is quite popular with the electorate. Why shouldn't we listen to the electorate rather than party leaders who oppose the measure when it comes to determining the form of our primary elections?
Well, we haven't heard the electorate yet, of course. We're going to hear the electorate in November. We've seen our polls. Now, I haven't seen Phil's poll. I'm sure it's a decent poll. I have seen other polls, so I've heard the 76% figure. That's a very high figure at this point for a poll. Typically, there'd be a high number of voters who haven't made their mind up yet. So I have seen other polls. The Yes campaign, not surprisingly, has sent me polls. They've sent me two results. One shows 1/3 opposed, 1/3 in favor, 1/3 are uncertain. A second poll shows 40% who are opposed, 30% who are, 40% opposed, yes, 30% in favor, and the rest undecided. Those numbers seem credible to me. Again, I haven't looked at either of these polls, how they're conducted. The 70+% number just does not seem reasonable to me at this point, given the level of public discussion, which quite honestly has been relatively low. So, yes, the voters should make their choice. They'll make the choice in November, and I hope they vote no.
Mr. Keisling, you have the option of a 45-second rebuttal.
When you ask people what they think of the idea, and they understand open primary, you can vote for anybody you want, and everybody can always vote for the best candidate regardless, and you know you cannot do that now. If you explain it that way and point out that people can see how people are registered, we've consistently seen 60 to 74% support, and that still holds. This challenge we have as a campaign, quite honestly, is this ballot title, and you can read it in your City Club bulletin, changes the general election nomination process. It centers on the parties, not the voters, which is the fundamental argument here. It's confusing to people. This is about letting voters control the system, not the parties. Parties are private organizations. How did we let this happen? We just let it happen. We can and should change it.
All right, next question to Mr. Keisling. Given the extensive litigation history surrounding Washington's top two primary, isn't it likely that Oregon's Measure 65, if passed, would also face court challenges that would delay its enactment in Oregon?
Sure. Anyone can challenge something that passes. Vote by mail got challenged. And by the way, many of the arguments about vote by mail, it actually have the opposite effect. It'll decrease turnout, it'll confuse people, and voters can't handle it or cause campaign costs to go way up. Same arguments were used by many of the same people. But the challenge in court, if and when it happens, I think this law will pass it with flying colors for two reasons. First of all, the resounding Supreme Court decision. You don't get Clarence Thomas in the majority and Scalia in the minority very often. 7-2 opinion on the Washington case, which, by the way, Washington voters like 80% to 20%, and they've had experience with the Oregon plan before. But the second reason I think we're safe, and why I think the legal argument is really a non-argument, is that we carefully wrote the bill so that the only provision that would cause a doubt would be severed and taken out of it if there's a problem. And that's the provision that lets you as a voter see the party registration status of candidates and possible endorsements. You like that, people want it, but if the court at the end of the day needed to get rid of it, this would still stand.
All right, Professor Gronke, 45-second rebuttal if you wish.
You know, I'm not a lawyer. I didn't go to law school, but I do know that there is a rich legal tradition surrounding political parties. To simply describe political parties as private entities, a language that, my clock hasn't started, by the way, a language, give me 30, language that Phil likes to use routinely, I just find misleading. We wouldn't have that kind of rich. Yes, it's true that Clarence Thomas wrote the majority opinion. Scalia and Kennedy were on the minority. And there are some aspects of that court decision that I'd like to return to in the Q&A. I don't want the moderator to take away all my questions. One last note on the polling question. You note, Phil said, when the voters are informed, you've got to see that polling question because those 70% numbers are just not believable.
All right, Professor, another question for you. Oregon has a strong legacy of election reform, being among the first states to allow the direct election of senators, citizen initiatives, registration by mail, and vote by mail. All of these reforms faced strong skepticism and criticism at the time. How do you respond to those who might say that your opposition to this latest proposed reform, the top two primary, is simply a case of preferring the comfort of the familiar?
Well, you know, Phil describes the opposition to voting by mail. I've studied this quite extensively. I don't think there were debates that this would lower turnout. There was opposition from both of the political parties, and in my mind, that's relatively easy to explain. Politicians are comfortable in the current system, and they don't like change. I have reforms that I am supportive of. The Montana primary, for example, is a primary election reform that I'd be very supportive of that provides all of the opportunities that Phil suggests without the problems in this reform. But look, election reform is complicated business. I understand that Oregon is a reform state. Is the argument then we should reform just for reform's sake? Other states have tried this reform. Other states, not Washington State, but other states are pulling back from this reform because it has not worked the way we expect. The data are out there. The historical examples are out there. I hope the voters of Oregon will not adopt this simply because they think reform is good and staying the way we are now is bad. The system is working well. I believe it's working very well. I hope most of you agree.
All right, Mr. Keisling, 45 seconds.
You know, if this were reform for reform's sake, I know I wouldn't have spent the last 7 years working on this. I don't think Vic Atiyeh and John Kitzhaber would be such strong supporters. John Kitzhaber noting that he thought Oregon was ungovernable because of extreme partisanship and a system that rewards polarization. Could the Oregon Health Plan even be talked about seriously today, much less passed? Governor Kitzhaber says no. We have a system in this state that no one alive created. It served us decently well for much of the century, but now it has increasingly become harmful to what we need to do, talk about, and accomplish as a state. And I'll just note this Montana plan. That's exactly the plan that Washington State voters were forced to adopt during the litigation period. And after they held their top two open primary, they said, we like the open one, 80% to 20%. This is about what the voters want. It's the right thing.
And Mr. Keisling, you argue that Measure 65 will bring voices of moderation into Oregon politics. Can you provide any evidence from states experimenting with similar primary election reforms that support your claim?
I think it's first very important to note that this is Oregon being a pioneer yet again. There really is only one state with this system, and that's Washington, and they've run it once. Louisiana doesn't even have a primary election, though. It gets drawn into these conversations, and my gosh, you know, of all the states, I think Oregon is least like, and I hope the argument isn't that if we do the Measure 65, we're going to have a chance we'll have a David Duke. Come on. Louisiana just lets everybody go to the general election, and then if no one gets 50%, they go to they have a runoff. We have an opportunity in Oregon to do something that is bold and innovative. And will it encourage moderation on certain issues where I think that's important? I think it will, because if you think about it, when every voter gets to vote in a race, you're not going to zigzag anymore as a candidate. You're going to get called out on that. But I think even more importantly, it's going to need creativity and innovation. We live in the most unsettling times in my lifetime. We need more than ever leadership, and leadership comes from thinking outside the box, not within these narrow partisan confines which the current system almost guarantees.
Professor Gronke, 45 seconds.
So my parents are in the room. My dad's mother turns 104 years old next week. Bless her heart. She's one of the last Cubs fans who remember the last time the Cubs made it to the World Series. She was around when this system was invented. This system is still working. Just because the system is old doesn't mean we should change it. You know, Phil's going to cite Thomas Jefferson in a little while, right, who wrote the Constitution. We don't abandon the Constitution just because it's old. There are more examples than just David Duke, right? Mechanically, the Louisiana system does work just like our system. In fact, in some ways, it's better. The people show up in November when they show up. The 1995 governor's race in Louisiana, where the top two candidates moved forward with less than 18% of the vote. The 2002 presidential election in France, where the top two candidates, including Jean-Marie Le Pen, anti-immigrant candidate, moved ahead with just 15% of the vote. The 1990 Peru election, Fujimori moved forward, and it was a disaster for Peru.
Professor Gronke, as you know, Measure 65 is proposed and supported by those in Oregon who believe the party system produces intense partisan bickering and excludes voices of moderation. If this measure isn't the solution to the election of ideologically extreme candidates, can you suggest a better alternative?
Well, sure, I have some that will never pass, and I have some that might pass. I will say that you should look out there at organizations like Fair Vote, which is an organization in Washington which works on election reform issues, that calls the Louisiana primary system, this type of system, the worst primary system out there. Look at equalballotaccess.org in California, which is starting to work against the current California move towards, calls this system the worst possible system out there. The Montana primary, again, the Washington voters chose not to adopt it. This would be a primary system where you choose the ballot, the Republican or the Democrat, you vote that ballot. Some states, in so doing, you renounce. It's not like getting divorced. It's just you say you're a partisan for one election. You can unrenounce it a minute later. You choose to vote down the Republican ballot, you choose to vote down the Democratic ballot, everyone can participate. I have no problem with that system. Nonpartisan redistricting, if you don't like these skewed districts, change the way we draw the lines. Multi-member congressional districts, these things have been tried, these things work. This has been tried and it doesn't work.
Mr. Keisling, 45 seconds.
This system, again, is one that lets every voter vote for the candidate they think is best. And you know, that actually does describe a system that we elect our nonpartisan races on. Vast majority of races actually let us do that. It's a familiar system. What we're asking to be done is that a system with some modifications that are key, you can't win it all in the primary, gets extended to a world in which we've traditionally voted on a partisan basis for a century. With all due respect to your grandmother, I'm glad she's still with us. She had nothing to do with creating the system. She was born probably the year it happened. Look, in a system that lets people pick one party or the other at the last minute and then switch away, you know, within seconds, okay, that still doesn't let you vote for the best candidate. You're still restricted to the one. So again, this system is worth not only a try here, but you look at Washington and the success and how much voters like it there. Talk to people in Washington that you know and ask them directly. They know this system intimately too.
Thank you. Mr. Keisling, suppose in the next governor's race, 4 evenly matched Democrats run and each get 15% of the primary vote. 2 Republicans run and each get 20% of the vote. According to Measure 65, only 2 Republicans would appear on the general election ballot. Is there something wrong with this picture?
Yeah, I think it'll happen probably once in a century or 3. It reminds me a little bit of a 1-7-10 split in bowling. You know, any scenario can happen. You know, Wes Cooley ended up getting elected, I think, with about 5% of the voters in his congressional district, but he won the Republican nomination with like 28% of the vote and then won the general election because overwhelmingly Republican, and we know that didn't end particularly well. In fact, I helped convict him of a felony. But sure, you can have weird splits on occasion, but you know, even if they were both Republicans, do we think every Republican is alike? That Vic Atiyeh and Tom McCall are the same as a Bill Sizemore or Denny Smith? No. And secondly, even if you have that kind of situation, okay, you have done it because everyone in the state has done it with their eyes open. Everyone has participated on an equal basis. You know, the parties want to keep their guarantee. They don't get it with this. But in exchange, the voters get to pick the best candidate regardless. I think that's so much healthier for democracy.
Professor?
I think it happens a lot more often than I would certainly ever knock down a 7-10 split. I gave the David Duke example again. I'll repeat the other examples. The 1995 governor's race in Louisiana. There were 16 candidates in the first round. The top 2 moved forward with less than 18% of the vote. 2002 French presidential contest, again, more than 10 candidates, the top 2 move forward, but less than 15% of the vote. You can do the math yourself, folks. 3 candidates, you need about 30%. 4 candidates, about 20%. 5, 6, 7 candidates, the percentages go down. Candidates do not try to speak to all the voters in this system. The way to finish second or better in a crowded contest is to find and hold onto your narrowly defined, intensely committed subset of the electorate. And look, folks in Multnomah County, Republicans, you're going to be facing 2 Democrats. Is that a choice measure? This is an anti-choice measure.
And Professor, another question for you. In the past decade, moderate Republicans like Jeanette Hamby of Hillsborough and Vic Backlund of Salem have lost and been replaced by conservatives far to their right. If Measure 65 had been in place, don't you think they could have survived the primary and won the general?
I can't speak to those specific races. I don't know what the candidate lineup is. Moderate Republicans are in trouble nationwide and in Oregon. Again, I refer you to Jacob Hacker's speech before the City Club in his book. You'll see it in a couple weeks. There are many reasons that the Republican Party has moved to the right, but it has nothing to do with the primary system. It has to do with large-scale changes that are occurring in this country. There's no reason to go through this long list, but there is a long list of Republicans and Democrats who have recently been elected to the legislature that I wouldn't identify as extreme. Tobias Reed, Brian Clem, David Edwards, Sarah Gersher, Dave Hunt, Ben Cannon, a supporter, Frank Morris, Ron Maurer. I mean, you can go on and on. And let's go away from the legislature. Our governors, they've been way out there. Our congressional delegation. I mean, where are the left-wing wackos and the right-wing extremists in that delegation? I just don't see it.
Mr. Keisling, 45 seconds.
Well, I actually think it's very good to listen to the people who are actually in the legislative process, and several of which you mentioned, Brian Deckard, Ben Cannon, Frank Morris, all big, strong supporters of the open primary. Take their word for it. They've been there. They've been in the trenches. They see how these dynamics work. And again, I need to ask you back at the people in this audience across the state. You know how the current system works. You know what it produces. It produces second and third tier issues taken first stage. It produces hyper-partisanship, where games of gotcha are a lot more important than solving problems. And you know it produces far too little in terms of constructive conversation and solutions relative to what Oregonians truly want. Now, we can talk about a few things that happened years ago in Louisiana, France, and Peru, but go up to Washington State, where there was no mischief, no weird splits, and in the 8 districts where it's D versus D or R versus R, they were all overwhelmingly DNR districts in the first place.
Okay, question, Mr. Keisling. Supporters of Measure 65 claim that it will increase voter participation overall. Can you offer any evidence from states with similar primary election reforms to support your higher turnout claim?
Well, I want to first start with the states that do it the normal way, the Oregon way, closed primaries, and there are variations of how quickly you can switch your allegiance or whether you just pick a primary when you go in. Let me give you a few numbers in 2008. This is today. Vermont, 8% of registered voters participating. Minnesota and Wisconsin, less than 15%. Have I just mentioned 3 of the most highest turnout states, great demographics in the country? Yes, I have. Participation is plunging through the floor. Plunging in state after state after state. Who then dominates and picks these nominees when turnout is only 15 or 20%? In Oregon, where we had 39% in 2006, just 39%, we thought it was pathetic, highest in the country. Median age was 60 years old. Is this healthy for our democracy when young people in particular, registered now as independents, are shut out of the process? Washington State actually had the highest turnout in the country in its top 2 primary, and I'm not counting the states whose presidential primary skews the numbers. We may hear that, but you got to separate that out because that's unique.
And Professor Gronke, 45 seconds.
Yes, I agree. Let's look at Washington. 25 plus third-party candidates on the ballot in the last election in 2004, I believe, and this election we have 5. This change will drive third parties out of business. That's why every third party and every major political party is opposed and 2 are neutral. Again, let's look at Washington. Washington turnout has been fairly flat. It's around 45%. Keep in mind the way this works. I hate to get up here and lecture, right? But Washington had an open primary, then they got rid of it, now they got it again. So turnout should go down and then up. It didn't. It stayed flat. Louisiana has had this primary. They're one of the lowest turnout states in the country. Hawaii has this primary. They're also a low turnout state. The open primary was used in a number of states prior to the Supreme Court ruling it unconstitutional. There's no evidence that it changed turnout in any of those states.
Professor Gronke, in opposing Measure 65, aren't you advocating the continued exclusion of Oregon's unaffiliated registered voters, approximately 1/4 of Oregon's registered voters, from the primary election process?
Absolutely not. I think I answered that question already. There are many reforms that are available that will allow unaffiliated voters to participate. First, under the current system, keep in mind, your ballot's coming to you. I think it was going to be 25 pages. I got my first volume of the voters pamphlet a few days ago. So you can vote more than half the races that are already on the ballot. You can vote for the county commissioner. You can vote for the judges. You can vote on down the ballot, right? All you're excluded from is those partisan races. Now, are you excluded? No, you can affiliate, all right? You can affiliate. Those are the rules of the game. It's not hard to do. You can then unaffiliate. Or we could be endorsing an option like the Montana primary that allows you to choose your affiliation by voting down that ballot, but retains the free association rights of political parties. Unaffiliated participation, I'll say again, has doubled in Oregon over the last 10 years. There is no evidence that unaffiliated voters are being driven out of this system. The bus project should be somewhere here today. They're bringing new young voters into this system. I don't hear them out fighting for top 2 primary.
Mr. Keisling.
Yeah, it's true that it's doubled in the last 10 years. It's gone from 12% to 25%. That's solely a result of vote by mail, folks, which we passed in 1998. 25% of the 400,000 plus Oregonians vote in the primaries. And yeah, I love judge races and county commission races. They're good, important offices. But you all know the races that most of us know matter most. U.S. Senate, U.S. Congress, governor, secretary of state, I'm biased, legislative, etc. Look, why do we have a system that excludes people? Why do we have a system that doesn't treat every voter equally? This is the question we should be asking. Why not make a change that treats every voter fairly?
And the next question is a question for both speakers. Each speaker will have 60 seconds to respond. We'll begin with Mr. Gronke. What impact is the top 2 primary likely to have on the cost of running a successful campaign?
Well, every indication is that this is going to increase dramatically the cost of campaigns. Listen, this is running 2 general elections. This is why when I sent an email out to 800 political scientists, none of them were one was supportive of it. You have to run 2 generals. You're going to have to face a wide set of challengers in May. You're going to have to try to get your voters out in May, where, quite honestly, a lot of voters are not paying much attention. Then you got to ramp right up again. You got to run again in November. Now, look, you ought to be spending money in November. That's a general election. That's a really important election. But to artificially raise that hurdle in May as well, I think it's actually going to exclude, not include, more candidates. I think it's going to include, not exclude, more interest groups. I think it will empower, not disempower, political parties, because they'll move to be giving endorsements again, behind closed doors. I see great problems in this in increasing campaign spending in Oregon politics.
Mr. Keisling.
First observation I'm going to make, because I've been a strong supporter of campaign finance reform for all of my career. I probably bored too many of you to tears talking about it in front of this very group. Supported limits, I've supported public funding. It's a huge problem. But it's fascinating to me that people think that because there's more competition in more races, and you have to reach more voters from the beginning in order to get elected, that that's a bad thing? Representative Ben Cannon testified to the legislature last session for this bill. And he said, look, I live in a predominantly Democratic district. All I need to do in the primary is just talk to the motivated Democratic voters. I can ignore the Republicans, ignore the independents, ignore the others. And that's all I need to win. This will make my life more complicated. I will have to work harder. I'll probably have to spend more money. But it's the right thing to do. Fred Girard on the opposite end of the ideological spectrum, conservative district, Marion County, same reason. Look, it's speculation about how the money is going to play out, but I think it's fascinating that some of the most well-heeled interest groups in the state, look at your voters' pamphlets, all oppose Measure 65, making the argument that, gee, people like us have too much power.
All right, thank you.
Fascinating.
During this portion of the program, each speaker will ask 3 questions of the other. Questions must be asked in 30 seconds. The opposing speaker will have 1 minute to respond, after which the questioner will have the option of a 30-second rebuttal. We will alternate between the speakers and begin with Mr. Keisling.
Yes, Paul, you are a very good student of the Oregon election system, so I want you to talk a little bit about the situation we face across the state right now in 2008. We have 76 legislative races that are on the ballot. Can you give me your judgment about how many of those races are actually competitive, where there's really, truly a meaningful chance that, that the leading candidate is not going to win, that the issue wasn't decided in the May primary?
No, actually, I have a good answer to that. No, I can't. I'm not actually a student of Oregon politics. I study primarily national and federal elections. And I think Phil probably knows this. I can't tell you how I think that this will turn out. I think we're going to have a Republican Eastern Oregon, and we're going to have a Democratic in the Willamette Valley. I mean, you're going to have Democrats against Democrats in Willamette Valley. You're going to have Republicans against Republicans in Eastern Oregon. If you're a Democrat in Eastern Oregon, I don't think you're going to be very, very happy with this measure. And if you're a Republican living in the Willamette Valley, I think you're also going to be very unhappy. But no, actually, Phil, I defer to you on that and how many competitive races there are. I honestly can't tell you.
Mr. Keisling?
Out of 76 races, I would estimate maybe 7 are competitive. In fact, 27 or so uncompetitive, there's literally only one name on the ballot. Minor parties have the right to put people forward, and 3 of them oppose this measure, though 2 are neutral. Yet, of the 76 races, there are only 9 candidates for minor parties even bothered to file. We have a situation where everyone, again, knows how the system works. You win the primary, the vast majority of the times the election is over. And quite honestly, Republicans in Eastern Oregon, Republicans, well-known Democrats in Eastern Oregon, they too overwhelmingly support the open primary, even though they know this could happen.
Professor Gronke, your first question of Mr. Keisling.
Sure. Phil, I'm in the uncomfortable position here of quoting Antonin Scalia, but let me do that anyway. Because you're the lawyer up here, not me, and I want you to speak a little bit and let us know about the constitutional situation. Scalia wrote, "It is no mystery what's going on here. There is no state interest behind this law except the Washington legislature's dislike for bright-color partisanship and its desire to blunt the ability of political parties with non-centrist views to endorse and advocate the candidates. You know that the reason that the Washington measure was thrown out was because it was a facial challenge. You know that the Ninth Circuit is now considering this again. You know the constitutional situation in Washington is still quite unsettled."
As I said, anybody can oppose a law once it's passed, and I fully expect this to happen. We've constructed our law very differently than the Washington law in 2 key respects. One is we haven't had a chance to talk, but I think it's very important. We let the political parties endorse candidates. In fact, they have that power now, so we're not letting them. But we then say that if the candidate wants to accept the endorsement, that too can get printed on the ballot as information to voters, so you will know. This was at the heart of Scalia's problem. In fact, in his language, he suggested that this kind of provision actually would meet his objection and might overcome it, because it lets the party communicate to its members whether somebody is acceptable or not. They can endorse multiple candidates. They can even endorse a candidate that doesn't belong to their party. So, for example, a Democratic party doesn't get someone in the finals, but one of the Republicans or independents or Pacific Greens they like, they can do that endorsement. It can show on the ballot, but again, it's only information. The voters will use it as they wish. I think this is a very elegant solution to the problem and makes our system actually superior to Washington's.
Professor Gronke, 30-second rebuttal.
So that was responsive. It was a facial challenge. The reason why Thomas threw it out is because they said in the court opinion, you could download it, that they need more evidence, they need more data. The data are there. The Ninth Circuit has reconsidered it. The constitutionality of this is very much in question. Phil will regularly tell you that they've answered the constitutional objections. They have not. I do not think we should be adopting a measure here and just kind of wait for it to be challenged in court. I don't think we should reform for reform's sake, and I don't think we should be adopting things and wait for somebody to sue us.
Mr. Keisling, your next question of Professor Gronke.
Paul, one of your best friends is a lifelong registered Republican and comes to you seeking advice about running for an Oregon public office. He's a very strong supporter of the war. He's strong free trade, pro-nuclear power. but he's also very strong a proponent of land use planning. He's pro-choice, and he favors physician-assisted suicide and a sales tax. What advice would you give him about running and winning?
Running now or running if the top two is passed? Running
Running
now, I
now.
guess if he ran now, I'd encourage him to, run his campaign, raise money, go out and try to convince the voters. If he's a Republican and he's living in Moulton, again, I don't have any context here. If he's a Republican living in my district, which comprises part of Southeast Oregon, I have a strong suspicion that there are many moderate Republicans there, and he'd probably move forward to the general and it'd be a relatively competitive race. Under the top two, I'd have him do what the gubernatorial candidate did in Washington. He'd make up a party name. Of course, that's what you could do under the top two, right? You make a, he's running under the GOP party or the Democrat, I'd rather be called Progressive Party, or all kinds of, I mean, the ability for manipulation under the system under this is quite strong. So again, if he's running under the top two, I guess encourage lots of moderates to enter, do gamesmanship in the system, because the possibilities are just endless under the top two.
Mr. Keisling.
Well, you switched to what you thought that candidate would do in the top two system. I asked you about it in the other system. But by the way, you can't do that in the Oregon law. The party registration on the ballot under our law is what it's on the voter registration card's official name. So that's not on point. The candidate I just described was Tom McCall. Now, you can't go home again. You know, this is 2008, not 1966. But do any of us believe that Tom McCall could have been elected under the current system as a Republican with these kinds of views that he held? We want a system that lets the best people run and get elected and have a fighting chance.
Professor, your next question to Mr. Keisling.
Phil, currently under the current system, neither major party, while they are allowed to do so, neither party makes candidate endorsements in the primary election races. Under Measure 65, the parties will not only make primary endorsements, but these endorsements are going to be printed on your election ballot. Now, you've said time and again that the system doesn't belong to political parties, yet this measure actually empowers political parties to make these endorsements behind closed doors in a less transparent system. Why do you support this change in the system?
Well, it's a fascinating argument because the parties themselves raise it as an objection. So I guess they don't want to have power. But, Paul, it's not a ceding of power. All that it is a recognition of what they have now. And you yourself raised the constitutional concerns. You can't have both ways. You can't say, well, I've got the real concerns, it's going to be thrown out in court. And then we have a provision that's precisely crafted to deal with exactly that kind of potential problem, I think in a very responsible way. But look, the party has the power now and they don't use it. You say they'll always use it? That would be really an interesting thing for parties to do, particularly in districts, let's say my Southeast Portland district, where we had 3 really good Democrats. You know, they're going to say we're only going to endorse one. They could endorse all 3 and say all 3 of these are good Democrats. Choose the best person. In effect, neutralizing themselves in a similar way, or they could just stay out of it. It's going to create some interesting situations, I agree. But again, I think it's constructive. Trust the voters. They get information, they can see who's for somebody, what the party registration is. At the end of the day, it's their system, it's not the party's.
Professor Gronke, 30-second rebuttal.
It's going to be a long, very long, complicated ballot. Long, complicated ballots are tough for voters. Voters look to things like endorsements to help them make their minds up on these long, complicated ballots. Meredith Wood Smith, head of the Democratic Party of Oregon, is in the room. Talk to her afterwards. Ask her what she's going to do. I don't know if the Republican Party is here today. Ask them what they're going to do under these systems, because everything I hear is that they are going to make endorsements under the system because it's the only method of control they have left.
Mr. Keisling, your next question to Professor Gronke.
Paul, this was not only a theme of your discussion today, but it was a theme of the City Club report. This will make the ballot confusing and complicated, because I presume there's going to be more candidates on it in May, although top 2 in November, there's fewer of them. I'm really confused about this argument. Do you really think that Oregonians can't sort through 5 or 10 candidates on a May primary ballot? They do it all the time in city council and mayor races, and that they're somehow going to make inferior decisions now under this plan than they do now?
Professor?
Well, I haven't seen the report yet. I guess Phil has. Yes, I do think that the more to anyone who has been on a committee, anyone who's run a meeting, you always know you have agendas. You try to reduce the choices because the more choices and the more people you have, the more problems that emerge. I don't want to go over them for the third time now, but there were 16 candidates on the ballot in the gubernatorial race that pushed forward 2 extremists in Louisiana. There were 10 plus candidates in France. David Duke got pushed forward. These are the examples that we have in front of us. Do I trust Oregonians are different in some way, are some sort of superior breed, that they're going to rise above these problems? I don't know. You know, I'm a professor. Kenneth Arrow is a Nobel-winning economist. He's written extensively about this. Too many choices and too many voters create problems, and I really, really worry about that. The voters are going to be confused. We just saw the debate here. Do you vote yay or you vote nay? You vote yes on both, no on one, yes on the other. Oh my God! And we're going to create this system.
Mr. Keisling, your rebuttal.
Well, I just fundamentally disagree. You know, people will make bad decisions, may not be as informed as you want them to be and know the nuances and the details, even the names of our U.S. senators. But I think the history of this country over 200 years is that people understand big things. And the big thing they understand about this current system is they're frozen out of it. 500,000 that can't vote at all. And all of us who can't vote for the best candidate in every election that's out there.
Okay, next we'll move to the final portion of the program, 3-minute closing statements from each candidate. We'll begin with Mr. Keisling.
You know, I very much appreciate this spirited debate. As I said at the beginning, this gets to fundamental issues of how we govern ourselves. And it is the governing of ourselves that is key here, not who wins elections at the end of the day. Can we constructively discuss the major problems? Can we even identify them? Can we then move to solutions and challenges? 7 years ago, I stood before the City Club and literally was the occasion for the first time openly talking about this idea. And I got to give Susan Nielsen, the Oregonian columnist, credit because she'd written about it a little bit before. And I asked the question, well, why not? Why can't we simply have parties continue to be part of this system, but don't put them in the driver's seat or keep them in the driver's seat? Instead, give information. We don't abolish the parties, as you notice. We could have, we don't. We don't abolish party registration. Parties are free to compete and get memberships. In fact, now they can compete for members on an equal basis and no one has to be disadvantaged. But why do they have to be in the driver's seats? Why can't we do it this way? And as I framed the discussion 7 years ago, I quoted one of my favorites with Abraham Lincoln, noting that the bromides of the past are no longer adequate for the stormy present. We must disenthrall ourselves and then we can save our country. The events of the last few weeks challenge every one of us here and in the country to ask whether the current institutions that we use are adequate to the stormy present, much less the much more uncertain future. I cannot guarantee that all the things that I and Norma and people like John Kitzhaber and Vic Attia and Earl Blumenauer and so many other people who've endorsed this, please visit our website. Can't guarantee all the things that we hope will happen will actually happen. In fact, I'm fascinated by the fact that opponents seem so much more certain of the things that won't happen or the bad things that will happen under this plan. But what I do strongly believe is that a system that lets everybody always choose the best candidate is going to lead not just to better debates, not just to more independent-minded candidates stepping forward who no longer have to listen to a litmus test, but, and this is key, it will lead to what is the essence of a healthy democratic society, which is accountability. When the vast majority of races are over in the primary, where the vast majority of people had no ability to have a say, much less did, then you lose accountability because, hey, I wasn't part of that decision. I didn't elect that person. I had no say in that person. People will choose to participate or not. But if you give them the chance in every election to participate, then they are responsible and part of the accountability metrics for the decisions that are made. Let us all compete on an equal basis, party candidates and voters. Let us vote for the best candidate that we believe is possible. I believe that is a system that will far better give us the leaders and what we need in the future than what we've seen And what's the definition of insanity in terms of doing the same thing over and over and over? Thank you very much. Vote yes on 65.
Professor Gronke.
Well, again, I'd like to thank the City Club and Phil, he and I have tangled now quite a number of times, and I have to say I've really grown to like Phil, and unlike some of the other debates at the state and the national level, where it's quite clear the opponents don't like each other, I don't think that reflects both Phil and my feelings. I really, Phil has worked very long for this measure, and he's worked long in this state, but working long and spending a lot of money doesn't necessarily make this a good idea, and I don't think that this is a good idea. Let me close by stating the obvious. I don't support this initiative. It's not because I question Phil and Norma's motivations. I just don't think the solution fits the problem. Measure 65 is a solution that doesn't solve the problem it's supposed to solve. In fact, at times the proponents seem to think the measure will solve all kinds of problems: citizen apathy, citizen mistrust of government, party divisions, youth turnout, government gridlock, maybe the financial crisis. I don't know. We did hear that today, the financial crisis too, my gosh. This will solve everything. I just don't see the problems that Phil sees in Oregon politics. It is true. Phil has said many times, if you think the world is great, then you should vote against this measure. Again, that means you think this is the wrench that fixes everything. I will vote against this measure because I just don't see the problems, the narrow problems that they identify. I don't see the extremists in Oregon politics. In our congressional delegation, Wu, Hooley, Walden, DeFazio, the governor, Ted Kulingowski, John Kitzhaber, we're not extremists. Bill Bradbury, Hardy Myers, Phil Keisling. No measure can do everything that this measure is supposed to do, and that should worry us as voters because we're not being clearly told what this measure actually will do. I think this measure will make political campaigns more expensive by forcing candidates to run 2 general elections. I think the measure will force citizens into a long and complicated ballot in May, possibly lowering, not increasing turnout, as Bill Lunch has suggested, and almost surely resulting in less, not more informed choices. And most worrisome at all, I think this measure will not produce moderate candidates, but will do just the opposite. It will push extreme ideologues into the November contest and force us to choose between an ideologue and an extreme ideologue. Is that what we need for increased choice in Oregon? I think not. Measure 65 is a solution without a problem. It is an answer without a question, and it is reform for reform's sake. It is the wrong reform at the wrong time, and it's wrong for Oregon. I urge that you vote no on Measure 65. Thank you.
I want to express our appreciation to our debaters, Professor Paul Gronke and Phil Keisling, who I think we can all agree are making exemplary contributions to Oregon's political process by participating in events such as this and by playing the roles that they're playing in this important Measure 65 discussion. So Paul and Phil, thank you very much. You bet. I also want to thank our moderator, Melika Johnson from KATU, and I want to just point out that we have these 2 tremendous debaters and this tremendous moderator, and what I'd like to suggest is that since none of the 3 of them are City Club members, that they did such a good job, though, that only half of the audience will ask them afterwards why they're not, rather than the normal full audience, because I think people like this should be members of the City Club, and I trust you agree. I also want to thank our True Squad, Patty Tillett, Jamie Armstrong, and Jeannie Crouch, and our timekeeper, Jonathan Rodemaker. And I want to remind you that we'll start next week 30 minutes early again, because we're going to have a vote on Measure 65, the report on Measure 65, as well as Measure 63. If you are not a City Club member and you haven't seen those 2 reports, they're available in the back of the room. And then we will have the single chair, single debate with Jeff Merkley for the U.S. Senate, unless Gordon Smith decides to show up. We don't know for sure. Thank you very much. We're adjourned.